Hi everybody, welcome back to Fertility Fact or Fiction. It is a Monday night, the 19th of October. Great to have you all with us again. We have a really tremendously important topic to review tonight that I think will be of immense interest to a lot of people that are watching. This should really help alleviate a lot of concerns from people and at the same time give you some really interesting information. This is a really technically sophisticated study done by some amazing people, and it touches on some of those hot button topics everybody likes to talk about, like immune-mediated implantation failures, recurrent implantation failures, and also problems with doing things like the ERA test and Receptiva and so on. So I think we've got a really exciting paper to review with you guys tonight. I hope that you all have been safe, everyone's doing well. Obviously, we're deep into the throes of round 2 of COVID, so hopefully you guys are all staying safe, your families are safe, and you're weathering the storm. We certainly want to send a huge shout out to all the moms and dads out there already who are struggling through this with kids that you already have in school and all that. I know it's a tough journey for those of you who have children and are struggling, and for those of you who are trying to have children, we're going to get you there, and actually this study kind of helps demonstrate that. So hopefully you'll all catch on to that as we go. And I also want to send a huge shout out to the egg whisperer, Dr. Amy Evazadeh, who interviewed me on the weekend, and on her YouTube channel you can find us there. Very nice lady from California who does some amazing interview work for fertility, and I think we're going to be having her on our show soon and go back on her show a little bit back and forth. We seem to have a lot in common and hit it off really well, so some exciting stuff coming up around the corner, and hopefully we can have you all join us there. Topic tonight is, does recurrent implantation failure really exist? And the reason we decided to ask that was I came across a study, again, it's in press, which means it's getting ready to be published. And that study basically looked at the rate of true recurrent implantation failure, to say specifically that it's actually quite low. And they looked at doing 3 embryo transfers in a row with euploid embryos. So these are genetically normal embryos, to see how high the success rate would be if you've done it enough times. So very cool study. So I'll kind of dive right in there, and then we can start talking about what it all means. So first thing to tell you about this study is this is retrospective. So they looked backwards at data that they already had. And the names in this study are pretty big names. In particular, Dominic de Ziegler is a huge name from Europe in the fertility world, does loads and loads of research and is very well known. And then Richard Scott, who is probably the smartest guy I've ever met, and the operations manager and sort of medical director of IVI-RMA worldwide. So Richard Scott is a brilliant guy. He's an embryologist who became a fertility specialist. He knows everything about everything and is probably one of the most widely published fertility specialists in the world. So this is a very interesting study. It involved a couple of different locations. They did RMA New Jersey. They had a hospital in France. They looked at another place in New Jersey and the Yale School of Medicine in New Haven, Connecticut. So some really top-notch locations, some top-notch programs, a lot of effort, and the names involved, like I said, are important because these are people who know their stuff and are not just going to publish junk science. So essentially what they did was they wanted to look at whether or not failures in implantations were related to the embryo or the patient or whatnot. And so they said, let's take a look at the number of patients that sequentially put in a genetically normal embryo and find out what the overall chances were that they conceived, were clinically pregnant and then went on to have a live birth. And they also even looked at miscarriage rates. So this is important data because it's actually not been done like that before. And so when we have a failed embryo transfer, and we especially if it's a euploid embryo where it has been genetically tested, we're all scratching our heads. We start looking for things to check. Is it the immune system? Was it the embryo itself? Was it the patient's uterus? Is there something else going on? How do we know what the specific cause is? How do we know what the problem is? And what do we test for? And what do we, more importantly, for all of you, out there who are going through this, what do we treat you with? So we all are trying to figure out what is going on when we have a failed transfer, especially when it's euploid, because we don't actually know what's wrong. So these guys wanted to answer that question. How many embryo transfers does it take, or are there some people that just genuinely have recurrent implantation failures? And so what they did was they looked at a pool of patients that had undergone sequential euploid embryo transfer. So in other words, they knew that they had a genetically normal embryo, and they went ahead and they did a frozen embryo transfer, and the whole population was frozen embryo, single embryo transfers. So none of these were fresh. All of the embryo transfers were frozen. So it eliminates that whole guesswork with fresh versus frozen. They wanted to make sure that they had an answer that was uniform amongst everybody, and that way they could compare the groups regardless of which country they were from. So in terms of the study population, it's important to note that the majority of the patients were younger, but they did actually allow anyone from the age of 18 all the way up to 45 years. They had to have a reasonable body mass index, so less than 40 and over 18, and no problems with their uterus or anything like that. It did not include patients with egg donation or gestational carriers or anybody with a major abnormality. And if your uterine lining was less than 7 millimeters after you took estrogen, they excluded you as well. So, important thing, these were not women necessarily that had multiple genetically normal embryos from one cycle alone. So if they didn't have remaining or residual normal embryos after one cycle, they actually put them through another cycle and then used the data from that second or even third cycle, and they go into the numbers for that, so I'll explain that to you. All of them did receive the pre-implantation genetic testing. That was done when they reached the blastocyst stage, which is really important, and everybody got it on the 6th day of progesterone exposure, after they had at least 7 millimeters of endometrial thickness. So that was the overall sort of protocol for this. The doses that they used were all with an antagonist protocol, anywhere from 150 to 450 units per day, so kind of a mix of everything. And that was basically it, and they adjusted them as they needed to. They used either HCG or a Lupron trigger, but interestingly not both. And they triggered when 3 or more of the follicles were 18 millimeters, which is what everybody should be doing. So that's really important. And when they did a Lupron trigger, they actually did a double Lupron trigger. They would do one trigger, and then 12 hours after the first one, they would do another one. They don't explain why, but that's what they were doing there. Their embryo preparation essentially involved monitoring the thickness of the uterus. They gave them daily estrogen and then progesterone. The progesterone was intramuscular, so these are shots. And on the 6th day of progesterone administration, so you've completed 5 days, they transferred in the embryo on that 6th day, which is standard. That's what we're all doing. And if you had more than one genetically normal embryo, they picked the one that looked the best. Okay, so 4,429 women met the inclusion criteria, and 4,111 of them used embryos from a single cycle, 297 from 2 different cycles, and 21 required a 3rd cycle in order to be included in this data pool. Average age was fairly young, so the average age is 35.4, and as you guys can all probably imagine, that's a bit on the younger side for patients doing fertility treatment. Usually it's more like 37, 38, 39. So these were younger patients, and the BMI was only 25.5 on average, which is very low. So realistically, these are pretty healthy patients with good numbers, good data. If you look at even their AMH value, it was 3 nanograms per mil, which would definitely be on the moderate to kind of higher side. Their day 3 FSH values were 8.7. Most of them had 12 to 13 eggs per retrieval, or at least per the first retrieval. So, fairly good success rates, 10.5 fertilized embryos. And they said that the rate of having a genetically normal embryo was 3.54 from just 1 cycle. So that's a good responder. These are selected patients who are having a good response. So this does not apply to everybody. And this is the reason these sessions, which I do for everybody out there, are important, because you can read this and say, oh, I just need to do this, but you also have to make sure the study actually applies to you. If the study doesn't apply to you, it doesn't make sense to go ahead and do it, to apply the data to you. So I'm just going to try and share for those of you who are on Facebook and YouTube and so on. And the application window disappeared, my friend Tarek. I have no idea where that went to. Oh, there. Okay, it's back. Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. It wasn't there a minute ago, but we've got it. Okay, so here is the data, and I want to kind of blow that up so you can all see it. For my Instagram friends, I'll explain it to you, because for some weird reason, social media doesn't love each other, so we can't share with everybody. Okay, so this is the first one, the first graph, which is really important to see. And I can read you out the numbers, but essentially what it shows is, this was when they looked for clinical pregnancy rate, so presence of a heartbeat. And what you need to know from this is, from the very first embryo transfer, they got 69.9% success rate, which is really quite high. So what you need to take away from that is, if you're a reasonably young, healthy patient with a genetically normal embryo, you kind of fit the bill of what they saw in this study, you've got a 70% chance of conceiving if your embryo is genetically normal. From the second embryo transfer, 59.8% of those patients then got pregnant. And then from the third one, 60.3%, right? So all those numbers are relatively close to one another. There's a little rise and fall. But what you need to know about that in total is that essentially when you add it all up together, there is almost 95% of the patients actually getting pregnant after the transfer of 3 euploid embryos. So almost the entire group is going to conceive if you have 3 genetically normal embryos and they're transferred in. And keep in mind, none of these patients were receiving any specific special treatments, no ERA testing, no immune therapies. It was just garden variety IVF with nothing special being done and nothing different being done from cycle to cycle. They just kept doing new cycles and transferring in more embryos. So you're going to get a very, very high success rate. When they calculated the actual odds, yes, they did drop as you went through successive cycles. So it's like 64% after the first cycle, like a 64% chance you would conceive. And then it drops down again a little bit further when you go into your third cycle. But really, it's very, very similar. And there was no statistically significant difference between the second and the third cycle. So try enough times, essentially, and you're going to get some success. And they actually looked to see if there was a difference in the age of the patients succeeding between the first or the second and the third. And they actually showed that age did not determine it at all. That was not one of the statistically significant factors. So if you have a genetically normal embryo and your age is higher, you don't need to be worried. If you can get 3 embryos, you should get that incredibly high rate. So the next part they looked at was, well, does this translate into live birth? And essentially the results are almost identical. So live birth, which is the gold standard, the holy grail, showed the same thing. So it was 64.8% with the first transfer, 54.4% with the second, and 54.1% with the third. So if you're getting into that kind of live birth data, the important thing here again is when you looked overall at everything, again, they're demonstrating that almost 95% of the patients cumulatively were getting pregnant. In fact, it was 95.2% will have a live birth if they have up to 3 euploid embryo transfers. And this is just something we've never seen before. So essentially, if you have enough genetically normal embryos without doing anything fancy, so no testing, no receptiva, no special test, no nothing, you know, no IVIG or steroids or any other treatments, you're gonna get a 95% chance of having a baby. So remember I said that, right? This is not just a opportunity to conceive. This is an actual chance to have a baby. They even looked at miscarriage rates, and they said after the first cycle it was 7.2%, 8.8% for the second, and 12.7% when you get to the third. So there is a little bit of a concern that maybe as you have to do this more and more, there may be some issues with some of the embryos, and that's probably why there's that 5%, but it looks like you have a very, very high chance of success. So the thing that's really interesting about this is that the authors say, essentially based on these results, and again, remember, these are guys like Dominic de Ziegler and Richard Scott, who is really the foremost guy in the infertility world right now. They're saying very clearly, and I quote, "Our findings challenge the publications claiming various uterine causes for recurrent implantation failure and suggest that it is of uterine origin is not a common entity in women whose uterus appears normal on saline sonography and or hysteroscopy." In other words, if your uterus is normal, the reason that your embryo is not sticking is the embryo. It's not anything about you or your uterus. They actually go on to say that all of the tests that are being done, including things like receptiva, including things like the ERA test, all of the various immune treatments and all that other stuff, are not necessarily justified, because even with doing nothing, these guys are getting that 95% success rate just by repeating cycles. So that is very, very important to know. Now, does this account for everybody? No. I mean, 4.8% of the patients are not getting pregnant. So those people do need some extra evaluation, treatment, and so on. But for 95% of you, 95.2%, do it enough times and you're going to walk away with a live baby. Why is this super interesting? Because Richard Scott is the director of the parent company to iGenomX, and iGenomX is the company that makes the ERA test. So he himself here is saying that it doesn't even make sense. There is no point in doing it because they didn't use it in this study, and they're still seeing exceptionally good success rates just by trying more times. So this is very, very important because there are millions of people out there spending thousands and thousands of dollars for tests, for treatments, for investigations, and sometimes they have no benefit. And that's the whole reason we set up this show, was to tell you the ERA test proven to be useless. We've gone over that data. You should not waste your money on an ERA test. Many of these other things not proven in many, many patients. Now, if you're in that actual 5%, you've tried multiple times, it's not working, sure. You need to have thorough investigations. You need to have options for treatment, and we don't want to abandon you. You are very, very important, and we need to focus on what's wrong. And if we do enough digging, we probably will find something wrong, and maybe those patients will benefit. But for 95.2% of you, you don't need anything extra done. So does recurrent implantation failure exist? It does, but the rate is extremely low, and realistically what you need to do is have a lot of patients have to just go through that one extra cycle, and then you'll succeed. Now, there's no question that this comes at a cost. So I don't know what the deal is in France. I'm assuming it's socialized over there. I can tell you that programs in the States often, especially I think in New Jersey, they have mandated insurance. So the companies get the IVF companies and the labs, they actually get their revenue source from the actual insurance companies. So you can do 6, 8, 10, whatever number of cycles you need, and certainly 2 or 3 is a no-brainer. It's easy for them to achieve. But bottom line is that if you do IVF enough times, even if you have to pay for it, you're most likely going to be successful, and you're most likely going to get a chance to move forward and end up with a baby. 95.2%, even if your age was all the way up to 45 in this study. So as long as your weight's okay, you're a reasonably healthy patient without doing anything fancy, you've got a very, very good chance. So I hope that'll be very useful to you guys. I was super excited when I read this. Yes, it does mean you might need more IVF cycles, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no hope. Try enough times and you will succeed. And yes, that does come at a cost, but that's why we've kept our costs low, to help everybody and let them have enough tries so that they can achieve success when you try enough times. So I know everybody's going to be asking, should we all do PGT? And the answer to that is no, because there is good data that supports the fact that PGT does not actually improve your success rates. And remember, knowing that the embryo was normal or not is not what made these cycles successful. They just know that if you end up with the genetically normal embryo going in, you're going to have that very high success rate. Certainly if you're over the age of 38, there's a difference and it supports it. But if you're a younger patient, you don't need to do it, because you know some of your embryos are genetically normal. And you know that even from the data here. In these young, healthy patients, mean age of 35, reasonable AMHs, reasonable weights, they had 3.54 for the rate, genetically normal embryos. So there's no reason to be paying for PGTA, because you can know ahead of time, if you're a healthy, normal patient, you're going to get a bunch of normal embryos. Why would you pay to find out something you already know? So save your money, don't bother doing it. It's probably even a little bit harmful. Most likely the success rates could be even higher than what these guys are showing without having to do that. And that STAR trial, which we've reviewed previously on the show, essentially shows that. So I will bring that part to a close. End of fact or fiction. So it is a fiction that recurrent implantation failure is common. It's a fact that if you do enough IVF cycles and you try hard enough, you will actually get a very good success rate and end up with very, very good results. I definitely want you guys to share this with as many people as you can. Spread the word. Try enough times. There's loads of hope. You should be able to achieve success. So I'm going to take questions. Remember always to subscribe and follow our YouTube channel, where all these videos are replayed afterwards. www.youtube.com/drvictory. And of course, if any of you have questions or concerns after the show, don't hesitate to send them to me and I'll happily go through them. So we've got a whole bunch of questions, and I think you have some